Okay, so now you know how to use different material types in Corona to get volumetric effects, and this includes the standard Corona material, Corona skin material, and Corona volume material. But there is one more thing, which is the Corona volume grid object, and you can use it to create things like realistic smoke and fire. So you will find the Corona grid object in the Create panel, then Corona, and then Corona volume grid. You can just create it anywhere in your scene. And then you will also need OpenVDB simulation file downloaded from some online source or created yourself in some plugin such as Phoenix FD or FumeFX, and then you can load it into your Corona volume grid. I already have a volume grid here, which is called Fireball. So let's just open it and let's take a look at its settings. Once we check the properties that we have in this Corona volume grid, you will see that they are similar to the ones available in the Corona volume material or in the Corona material with volumetric scattering mode, and this is because they work in a similar way. And it also means that if you learn to use these parameters in one of those places, it will be definitely easier for you to use them in the other places. So let's take a look at the shading parameters that we have here in the Corona volume grid. You will see different properties such as emission, absorption, and scattering, and you will see that for those properties you can use different channels. Those channels are something which is baked into the OpenVDB file that we are using here, so they are generated with the simulation software, and you simply have to experiment, or you have to know which ones should be chosen for each property. So first we can try just disabling emission and disabling scattering and just focus on the absorption. So again, like with the case of other volumetric things that we saw, absorption can be used to decide about the general thickness or density of your material or object. So for the absorption, we can use the smoke channel that we have here in our OpenVDB file, and this will basically tell us where the smoke is. Then we can use tint to decide about the absorption color. So this is again very similar to what we have in the Corona material or in the Corona volume material. And then we have scale, which is like a multiplier of the absorption. So if we increase it, you will see that our object becomes more dense and darker. And if we decrease it, it will become more transparent and generally brighter and will pass more light through it. So once we are happy with our absorption and we choose the correct channel, we can then focus on the scattering, and again it's the same like in the case of volume materials. So I should just enable that scattering property, and then I can either select the channel that I need from the OpenVDB file, or I can just set it to constant, and this means that the whole object or the whole grid will have the same scattering everywhere, and this is what usually works best for things like smoke or fire. So let me set it to constant, and then again we can decide about the color, texture, scale, and directionality, so the things that we have in the volumetric materials. So I can make it brighter or darker, and I can change the scale, which is again something like a multiplier. So if I increase it, it will become even brighter, and if I decrease it, it will basically become darker. And then there is directionality, which works the same as in the Corona volume material, so it defines how the light interacts with the volumetric scattering. And again we have single bounce only option, which basically removes some realism from the object but makes it render much faster, so let's keep it enabled. And finally we have the emission property in our volume grid, and again we can enable it and we can choose what channel should be used for this. If we set it to constant, that's probably not what we want, because the whole object will become glowing or will emit light. So we should basically find the right kind of channel. Smoke seems to work quite correctly, but probably the one which will work best, especially for fire, is temperature. And this basically tells us that the glow will be more intensive in the areas which are hotter, and the ones which are colder will not be glowing at all. So for a realistic looking fire, you have some other properties here. The most important one is mode. It lets you define how the colors and the intensity of this emission is interpreted from the file. So for things like fire, the black body option will work best. You can also try with some other ones, but the black body is definitely going to work best because it's based on the data from the OpenVDB file. So like I mentioned, the hottest areas will be glowing most and will have correct color, and as it gets colder it will glow less and will be colored more towards red, which is what happens in real life. Then you have some other options in this emission property, and this includes tint, which will basically color your emission. So if you are creating some magic fireball or some sci-fi themed effect, you can just change the color here. You have the scale and temperature scale. So if we change this, you will see that the scale is basically something like the overall intensity of this emission effect. So we can decide whether it should be brighter or darker. Just like this. And temperature scale decides how the temperature is interpreted. So currently we found out that this value works fine here, and this means that the hottest areas here are the brightest, and it gets colder here. And if I change it, let's try with 400 or maybe a little bit more, 2000. Now I'm saying that this area here is colder, but it still glows. And as we go up and it gets even colder, it stops glowing. And if I increase it, so let's try with 3000, then 4000, I am now basically changing the temperature of the object, and it starts glowing more, and it changes the color of the glow. So if I use some very high value, the whole thing will now start glowing. It now has become extremely hot. So again, this is something that you will probably have to define by experimenting, by some fine-tuning and tweaking of those parameters. Now the last thing is channel color mapping, and this basically lets you define a gradient which will be used to color your object, or in this case your emission. This is also available for the other properties like absorption and scattering, but it will be easiest to visualize what it does by using the emission channel. So let's go to channel color mapping, and let's just make sure that we are not using the black body mode but the channel mapping mode. So once again, channel mapping, and now we can define the colors which will be used for this gradient. So we can try from blue to maybe let's try with green. And again, we are here getting something like some sort of magical fireball. And now we can play with the curve, we can play with the colors and just find what works best for us. Maybe something like this. And here we have something called scaling, which works in a similar way to the temperature scaling here. So if we increase it, it will increase the area which is considered as glowing. And if we decrease it, you will lower the glow, or you will completely get rid of it at some point. All of this may be a little bit confusing at first, so it definitely requires some experimenting. We also have a help desk guide which explains the different parameters of Corona volume grid, and you can find the link to this article here. That's the end of part 4. In the next one, we will talk about optimization tips and tricks.